Let me begin by welcoming all of you formally. This is the Cambridge Paper live event. My name is Jonathan Tame. I'm the director of the Jubilee Centre in Cambridge, which is a social reform think tank. We explore issues in public life from the perspective of the Christian faith in order to make a positive contribution to some of the dilemmas and debates in our culture and society. And every quarter we publish a Cambridge paper, which is a 4,000-word essay looking at a specific contemporary issue. And then we invite the author or authors to present their paper at a live event so that we can discuss their thoughts and proposals with them and really get a conversation started around the paper. And I'm delighted to welcome the three authors of the latest paper on surveillance capitalism, as it's called. I hope that many of you have seen this paper, had a chance to read it. And I'm just going to introduce the authors by reading their bios from the back of the paper. So Jonathan Ebsworth, firstly, has spent his career working with information technology, and he's recently established a small consulting practice focused on human-centered technology innovation and co-founded techhuman.org, which is a website aimed at offering insights into how we can live well in a digitally dominated world. Secondly, Samuel Johns writes on identity, immediacy, and technology in the late modern world, with a particular interest in human personhood. He studied at the University of Oxford before pursuing a Master of Arts at UBC Vancouver on the philosopher Charles Taylor's work, The Malaise of Modernity. And then lastly, Michael Dodson is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge studying computer science, and his research focuses on security and privacy, where digital equipment meets the physical world, such as in water and power utilities, medical devices, and automotive applications. So you'll hear all three of them shortly. So here's how the afternoon is going to proceed. The three authors will start off by introducing or summarizing the paper and then respond to three of the most common objections to the arguments that they're making. Without any further ado, I will hand over to Samuel, who is going to introduce the topic for us. Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this discussion and this conversation this afternoon. You may have heard it said that I have nothing to hide, and therefore privacy is of no concern to me. I have nothing to hide. I'm happy to share all my data. We'd like to reframe that question this afternoon. And in many senses, the purpose of our paper is to reframe that question. And we've written this paper on surveillance capitalism, perceiving it to be an important and incredibly pressing issue. Are we citizens with leaders, or are we increasingly becoming subjects with rulers? To quote the whistleblower, Edward Snowden, in full, he writes this. He says, arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. The point of a right isn't necessarily for today, but a right is enshrined for tomorrow, perhaps for the day when I may disagree or the day when I may need to voice difference. And as Christians, I think we can say that this is particularly significant. So perhaps the underlying question to this is, do you value your voice? Do you value your voice? Many others value it immensely. And here's a snapshot of the sorts of data that they're after: your age, your gender, your address, your citizenship, your educational background, your nationality, marital status, occupation, information about your income, your medical record. There's all sorts of data that many people are incredibly invested in finding out about. And just to start off, we can say, is anyone else talking about this issue? Or are we the only people in this room talking about it now? And the response is firmly yes, many people are talking about this. You might have seen a recent advertisement by Apple where the stem of the apple has been converted into a padlock. And they're encouraging Apple users to think about privacy. They released at the end of April 2021, iOS 14.5. And about a week or two later, this was a headline statistic that came out of this. 87% of global iOS users opted out of data tracking by third-party applications with the new software. 87% opted out of data tracking. in third-party apps. What that really means is 9 out of 10 people are opting into privacy. When they're given the choice, 9 out of 10 people are opting into privacy. Why is that the case? Suddenly the offer is now there. Prior to this, it hasn't been there. Why are 9 out of 10 iOS users opting into privacy? This is the sort of question that we want to be asking. And we've done this by shedding light on the logic of surveillance capitalism in this paper. So to start in this work, I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to lead us in the introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Samuel. So before we jump directly into this discussion about privacy and whether data collection is good or bad, we have some terms that we need to introduce to familiarize various people who have different levels of use of these applications or familiarity with the conversation to this overall topic. And we also want to get to know some of you who are in this sort of quote room with us right now. And so we're hoping that we can ask a couple of questions, and what would normally be sort of a hand-raising kind of thing, that you would be willing to put some answers into the chat. So we'll give you a second to hopefully get the chat open. Maybe you have it open already because you're gearing up some comments or questions. But the first question here, which is a bit tangential to our main thrust, is where do you primarily get your news? So do you have a broadsheet? Do you primarily listen to the radio? Do you use like the BBC's website or the Guardian's app for your phone? Or do you use a news aggregator? Do you rely on Apple News or Facebook News or Google News? We'd be grateful for a couple people to provide some input here. All right, we've got lots of variety here. BBC website, TV, excellent. I don't even think I said that, but I definitely should have done. I skipped right to radio. BBC, The Guardian, less mainstream websites. Okay. So there are lots of sources of news. And the next question is, if you put down, if you provided an answer, who does the editing for that? For the news mechanism that you put in, who decides what's on the front page? Yeah, so we have staff from the news organization. We have editors and editorial board. We have this interesting, which I think is a good answer from Joel, about you get some independent editors. And this is kind of curious because it really depends on where the news is coming from, right? So if you have a broadsheet, you have an editor or an editorial board who needs to decide really the night before what they're going to publish, because they only get one shot at it. If you're using a news aggregator like Apple News, it's looking at your past history and deciding based on all the news stories that it could present to you right now, what it thinks you're going to like. So really, you're the editor of Apple News. And websites are interesting because they're kind of in between. They have an editorial staff, but they also have the ability to dynamically manipulate their content. And here, what we want to introduce is this term of maximizing engagement, that web applications, any kind of service on the web is attempting to win your attention through maximizing engagement. And I'm going to pick on the BBC because I actually think that they are the least bad, is the way that I would put it. But we'll talk more about that later. Anyway, what you'll see here is you have the splash screen. So this is the main BBC website. And most of these websites also have a most read or a most viewed series at the bottom or partway through. And you'll see a correlation between them. And that shouldn't be surprising, because you would expect that the things that are on the front page are the things that most people are reading. What is unexpected and maybe raises some questions is that occasionally something which is a day old, a week old, sometimes even a couple of years old, ends up not only high in the top 10, but then moves on to the front page of the website. And that raises some questions about how that front page is chosen. And most of the time it is an algorithm that is simply saying, if lots of other people want to read this thing, regardless of how old it is, then let's put it on the front page because probably you also want to read that. So it's the sort of simplest of algorithms to try and increase your engagement with a particular service, and in this case, with a news service. And so they're trying to maximize they're trying to maximize your engagement, because if you're engaging with their service, you're not engaging with somebody else's service. And many of these services have become very good at this. So I wonder whether anybody would be willing to admit or say the number of times, possibly in the last couple of weeks or even the last month, you've sort of stayed up later than you had expected because you were moving from one thing to another on one of these websites. So this happens to me a lot with David Attenborough, right? The BBC puts a little clip from a Blue Planet or something like that, and I watch it, and then the next clip comes up right after it, and I watch that, and I think, well, this is only going to be 30 seconds, so I'll watch another one right after that. And before I know it, an hour or two has gone by, and I know everything about turtles that David Attenborough can tell me. And this is a pretty phenomenal advance in the attention economy. On the top right here, you see YouTube. You might notice that I'm not signed in this case, and yet YouTube has profiled me quite strongly. So everything on there is related to something that I've watched in the last year, not even just in the last week. And so what they do is, as soon as I finished a video, they put up all of the things that they think I'm going to like, and they hope that I'll just click on one and move on to the next thing. Then I'll say, oh, it's only another 5 minutes. I might as well watch that. And they're quite good at deciding what the next thing is that I want to watch. On the top left here, we have the next advance in that. This is part of what I would call a passive or low attention processing part of that maximizing engagement. And this is autoplay. Basically, you finish watching a video and you sneeze or blow your nose, and 5 seconds later, it's already playing you another video that it expects you're going to want to watch. So it takes away even the action of having to choose to watch the next thing, and it just moves you on to another video. Videos, because we are so visually perceptive, are outstanding at encouraging us to continue to consume content in a passive and low attention way. And in doing this, they're also competing with everyone else who's trying to provide us the same kind of thing and attract our attention, and they're doing it quite successfully. Oh, move twice. Okay. So we've talked about the attention economy or maximizing engagement. We've talked about low attention processing or passive processing. And now we're going to talk about the way we schedule our day. So about well over 80% of adults in the UK own a smartphone. And on average, you get over 100 notifications per day. So that's 7 notifications per waking hour over the course of the day, which means in the time we've been introducing this subject, on average, we would have all received 1 notification. Notifications have moved us from a scheduling economy to an event-driven economy. So it used to be that you would read the newspaper at a fixed time of the day because the newspaper would turn up at your house at a fixed time of the day and you had something scheduled afterwards. You would read your mail at a fairly fixed time of the day because the mail turned up at a certain time of the day. If you're in the office, you might be interrupted and have some hot work item that you need to take care of. But in general, you also have fairly scheduled things to do during the day. And so your attention is allocated in sort of units throughout the course of your day. What notifications have done is change that to a passive event-driven scheduling, which means instead of processing all your mail at once or reading all of your news at once, you read mail as it comes in. You get a notification about some news item and you either read it or ignore it. You get a calendar event, you get some kind of task from a boss, or something comes in from your child or your grandchild and you engage with it or ignore it just then. I'm getting a notification right now. I apologize for that. The various internet services have gotten very good at this, because if they just sent you 1,000 notifications, you would eventually just mute them. But what places like Facebook have done is maximize the ability to give you something which you find interesting. So what they want to do is maximize the number of engagements you have with them without forcing you to silence what they do. And they do that through some very complex algorithms, and they do it very successfully. And that is why you average well over 800 notifications per week if you're the average person in the UK. And so what we'd like to do for this presentation is actually resensitize some of us to notifications. And we would be curious if you would be willing, if you get a notification over the course of this presentation while we're moving along, if you would just drop a note into the chat, and perhaps we'll have a visual indication at the end of the presentation of how many notifications this group of 20 or 30 people is getting during a 45 minutes period. All right, so we've talked about attention, the attention economy, maximizing engagement. We've talked about passive or low attention processing, and we've talked about moving to this event-driven attention economy. But this paper is supposed to be all about surveillance capitalism, right? So maybe this covers the surveillance part, but what about the money? If I never click on any of these adverts, how is anybody making money out of me? And I'm going to pass over to Jonathan to discuss that topic.
Thank you, Michael. That's part of the genius of surveillance capitalism. You don't even need to be using their software or clicking on their adverts to be helping the protagonists make money. They're harvesting your online footprints almost everywhere you go. Increasingly, they're tracking your physical footprints and actions as well. So what is surveillance capitalism? Here's a definition that is derived from Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. First of all, it is quite new. The ideas that underpin surveillance capitalism really were derived by Google around the year 2001 and have developed from there. So it is a new economic order. And Google, desperate to make money, decided that the technology they were using to make their search engine as good as it was and continues to be, could be used to present targeted content to users. And in order to make that work, they had, just as they had with search, to aggregate as much information, as many of the digital tracks that we leave behind, and turn them into their own private store of raw material so that they could predict, influence, or even change our behavior. In some cases, driving sales, and increasingly now, increasing engagement and sometimes changing attitudes. Google started this, but they're not the only ones playing this game. Facebook, who didn't even exist at the time that Google started this journey, have adopted this and actually taken it almost to a new level. Microsoft are practicing many of the techniques of surveillance capitalism. Amazon, pretty much all the social media organizations like Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok have jumped on the bandwagon in one way or another. As a result, we have a small number of privately owned and controlled companies amassing unprecedented levels of wealth, knowledge, and power, as we're going to show you on the next slide. In the 19 years from 2001 to 2020, Google's digital advertising revenues grew from $70 million to almost $150 billion. Facebook, a company which didn't even exist at that point, have grown their advertising revenues to almost $90 billion a year. And Amazon, an online retailer that sells everything, a relative latecomer to the surveillance capitalist party, have grown their ad income to 14 billion by 2019 and are doubling that number every 2 years. Just these three companies together are generating something equivalent to the GDP of a country the size of Romania in advertising revenues. And that's not the only revenue they get, but it is the dominant part of it. So some people would ask us, why is this any different than advertising? It's just trying to get people to buy stuff and do things perhaps they might not want to do. And at that superficial level, it's true. However, in the surveillance capitalist model in the digital age, this technology reaches further and faster than any previous way of purveying a message has existed in history. Advertisers can target users and groups of users with greater precision than ever before. And at the most basic level, their conversion rates or their attention rates are simply far better than historical alternatives, which is why newspaper advertising is declining, television advertising is drifting downwards, and more or less now we're at the inflection point where digital advertising is the dominant force. But to sustain that model, the surveillance capitalists have to build ever better databases. They have to increase their reach. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. They have been busily growing, relentlessly acquiring companies of what they would generally see as complementary businesses to increase their reach. They're exploiting global regulatory weakness that is allowing them to become monopolies at a scale unseen before. And they're lobbying the major parliaments in the United States and the European Union in particular at higher levels, and I mean that in terms of monetary spend, than almost any other industry. Each of these businesses, and many of them you'll recognize, are being used to increase the level of engagement the surveillance capitalists have, and extending their reach ever deeper into our lives and our relationships. In the case of Google, they even own the operating system that runs the most popular mobile phones that are run in the Western world. Wherever these phones go, Google can track where they are and know who's using them. The surveillance capitalists have amassed billions of users, many of whom now have little choice if they want to remain connected to their friends and acquaintances, participate in social and professional activities, and even interact with medical professionals. At this point, it's probably worth giving Apple a special mention, not because they're wonderful or bad. Simply, we started saying that Apple are beginning to take a stand ostensibly in favor of privacy. And in general, their behaviors are moving them in that direction. But you should be aware that they are still receiving billions of dollars from Google to put Google search on their iOS devices and enable Google to sustain their surveillance business model. Whoever owns a specific business, it is becoming increasingly hard to avoid being dragged into that surveillance ecosystem unless you simply do not use technology at all. So if we move on to the next slide. On a more positive note, the products these companies are providing are often genuinely useful. Google search is still by far the best search engine out there. Facebook houses many valuable special interest groups, particularly for families trying to deal with rare medical conditions. But we're paying a really high price for the privilege of using these tools. Every time we use them or touch a website that contains one of the covert trackers these companies have been promoting, or our experience has been converted into data, this extends to health trackers, smart alarms, smart speakers, doorbells, you name it, it's all there. Whenever we're being given excellent products for no visible cost, we should be asking ourselves whether we are in fact becoming the product that that company is selling, not the customer. So it is with surveillance capitalism. Our lives, experiences, and data have become a traded commodity in the hands of organizations who are now sold out to amassing ever greater wealth and power. And I'll hand back to Michael at this point.
There we go.
There you go.
So the big question that many people ask at this point is, why should I care? Either, as Roger pointed out, I don't participate in sort of the smartphone ecosystem, and so this isn't a problem for me, or I get great services and my data seems like it's a good trade. So we're going to talk a little bit about that for a few minutes here. So the first reason, and this addresses those who even aren't engaged, is that these companies, in their seeking ever greater amounts of data, continue to push into the private lives, even of people who aren't participating with their particular services. And they use it in what has been admittedly pejoratively called the dispossession cycle. So this is clearly somebody, it's actually Zuboff who coined this term. But the idea is that these companies look to move into an area that has previously been considered private, and then they have a very strategic mechanism for dealing with the surge of outrage and bad publicity that comes from what is considered a privacy invasion. And then they manage to smooth out the backside of that. And we all become acclimatized to that movement into an area that we previously thought was private. So a great example of this is Google Street View. It started in 2007. The idea was that they drove cars down all of our streets, took pictures of our streets, our homes, our cars. If you happened to be walking into or out of a house, they took a picture of you. They had all of the registration information for our cars. They were even listening in on Wi-Fi. They were recording all of the data that was being broadcast on Wi-Fi from all of the houses. This had never been done before, certainly never at scale. and they've now done it basically around the world. So there are several billion homes that are now on Google Street View. There was a major outcry in 2010 for lots of reasons, and some countries attempted to ban it. And Google put out an extensive public relations campaign, which involved a small apology for putting people's faces on there. But as we may or may not know, this service is still readily available, right? It has been mainstream Google product for over 10 years now. We are way past stage 4 here. And you can tell that because Google Street View is in no part of the current regulatory conversations that are happening in the EU or the US or anywhere else. We are totally okay, it seems, with what we considered 10 years ago to be a major privacy violation. And this kind of thing has happened dozens and dozens of times since then. And notably, this affects you whether or not you engage with any of Google's services at all. So they've moved into what we previously considered private areas. They also, again, I'm going to poke at the BBC because I actually like them so much. They also force what should be neutral companies to engage because they become the sole arbiters of the attention economy. So we've already talked about sort of the simple algorithms that the BBC and other websites use to maximize our engagements. What you might not know is that even the BBC and all other news websites make efforts to track you and identify you individually. So this is my browser, which tells me that it's blocked 3 trackers here. These are trackers which basically create a unique fingerprint for either my browser or my computer so that the BBC can identify me and develop a profile for me across the different articles I look at or the different BBC services that I use. And they increasingly are asking you to sign in. So the BBC has these banners that says the BBC is better when you sign into the BBC. And I'm not asking you to read this text here, but what you may not know is that what they do when they create those profiles is they then buy targeted advertising on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and other places. And they correlate the things that you have watched with what they think you might want to watch in the future. And they try to present those advertisements to you. So the BBC, because they are competing for your attention just like everyone else in order to justify their existence, are being forced to engage with these few data brokers, basically Facebook and Google as the primary data brokers, in order to gain your attention. And just to show that I'm not only picking on the BBC, the Times gives me 7 trackers, the Daily Mail, perhaps unsurprisingly, gives me 14. The Guardian, perhaps surprisingly, gives me 25 different trackers. So they are really trying to profile me specifically and individually. So what are the problems here that we've presented? First, that the data and knowledge that they acquire gives them a huge amount of asymmetry in their ability to influence my life and modify or influence my behavior. 2, that they continue to push into areas that we previously thought were private in order to gather this data. And 3, they basically force everyone to engage, right? Otherwise, neutral entities like the BBC are forced to engage if they are not going to become irrelevant over time. So that's sort of the corporate, the large scale, the governance part of things. What about individuals? Well, we've talked about this attention economy, this maximizing engagement. And what they've discovered is that many of the ways that people engage with technology are highly addictive. And so they encourage those things. In the paper, we discussed this extensively, the shift of the idea of friendship from something which is symmetric and synchronous to something which is voyeuristic and asynchronous actually is highly addictive in the way that people engage with the technology. And we see that this has adverse effects across the age spectrum. So for young people, it has major self-image problems. It seems to correlate very strongly with depression and self-harm, particularly in young women. And in adults, I don't think any of us will be surprised to find that it leads to a large degree of polarization. And actually, it results in polarization very, very quickly. So all of the studies show that it requires very little engagement before somebody who was previously neutral, investigating arguments on both sides, falls very strongly into one camp or the other, never to come out of that camp again. So putting this all together, how do people make money out of this? We have these platforms that attempt to maximize our engagement, sometimes in very addictive ways. They attempt to move us from a schedule to an event-driven mentality in a way that causes us to engage in what I would call a passive or a low attention consumption way. And it turns out advertisers have known for a long time that that mentality, that low attention processing, is the most effective way to move ideas into long-term memory without the consumer realizing that they're learning anything. So basically what that means is that social media and the internet economy generally is a perfect mechanism for advertisers, whether they're selling a product or an idea, to shift our behaviors, our ideals, and our relationships in subtle but very specific ways. So some people look at this and they're like, yeah, I know. In fact, I think you're underselling it. Other people say, I'm still not convinced this is really a problem. But some of you might be saying, actually, this is the first time I've been exposed to this, and I really don't like that. But I'm just one small person. Like, I feel very small and powerless. So what do I do? How do I deal with that? And I'm going to hand over to Samuel to help us sort of engage with the next step here.
Thanks, Michael. I'm only one user amongst billions, so what difference can I make? Why should I even care? It's probably a question many of us have. And yet I want to question that logic a little bit. The actions of individuals do matter. And we can say that right off the get-go by saying that actually the very logic of surveillance capitalism depends on the individual actions of individuals. As Jonathan quoted earlier, we have this sort of working definition of surveillance capitalism from Shoshana Zuboff, a new economic order built around aggregating human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of prediction, behavioral manipulation, and sales, resulting in unprecedented concentrations of wealth, knowledge, and power in the hands of private companies. The first word is probably in bold there is the operative one of aggregation. Yes, human experience happens at the individual level, and what the surveillance capitalists are doing are aggregating that into significantly larger data sets that can be then used for prediction, for manipulation, and for sales. But that doesn't mean to say that the individual actions of individual persons are not significant. So I think it's important to consider that logic just as we get off. In the third section of our paper, we've written a little bit about practical advice. So we want to walk into that now and reflect a little on some of the areas of practical sort of guidance and issues that we're trying to raise. As something to flag right up front here, we're not policymakers. None of us are working in a political arena or sphere. So we've avoided this domain because this is not really where we're located. But we have provided some tentative first steps in directions to consider in terms of very concrete practical actions. So the first one would be choose your web browser carefully. Choose a web browser like Safari or Brave or Mozilla Firefox that allows you to have visibility, as Mike just showed, of what is being tracked and specifically on what websites. Secondly, change your search engine. There's lots of good search engines out there. DuckDuckGo, we've listed in our paper, Ecosia as well, that provide a very good service without linking all your searches and building up a picture, a kind of persona in the background. Thirdly, pay for the services that you value. Avoid the rest. When you pay through a subscription service, you're often automatically discounted from advertising. And you're also recognizing the actual legwork that goes into the production of that service, whether it's a media outlet or otherwise. So consider paying for services that you value. Fourthly, put your devices to bed in the evening. That might sound a bit bizarre. What do we mean by that? Put your devices in their own bed in the evening, not in your bed. So don't take them to the bedroom with you, firstly. And secondly, send them off to bed when it's time to have a conversation, when it's time to read a book, when it's time to wind down with your family, with your friends, to be able to kind of reclaim that space in the evening without the constant push notifications that might be calling for our attention. And finally, on that point, think about time budgets within apps. There's lots of good things coming out now, particularly as we flagged earlier with iOS 14.5, helping budgeting within the use of apps to help kind of have awareness recognition of what your usage looks like across different days of the week on different apps. We want to add to that something else, and that's this idea of a rule of life. One of the best defenses against addiction and exploitation and manipulation that we identified before, as well as busyness, may well be the adaptation of the ancient practice of a rule of life. It's important here to notice that these aren't rules of life, just to have a long list of rules, 10 or 12 steps to managing your smartphone, but actually a rule of life. And it's something we're going to come back to in a moment, just considering a few other authors as well. We also want to really encourage this idea of generous conversations. How can we host generous conversations, particularly with those who we may disagree with? How can we host conversations with those that we have very different, often strongly different opinions to? And the polarization of the web is driving a fissure in that, making many of these conversations impossible or impassable. How can we try to stitch up some of those differences and actually allow some of these conversations to speak across a chasm of difference? We've given a few examples of people hosting generous conversations. So on the right-hand side here, you've got Praxis Labs, who are in New York, who work particularly with entrepreneurs. But the writer, Andy Crouch, has contributed to them significantly and written lots of good work on this. The TechWise Family, My TechWise Life, practical, concrete, applicable steps for managing technology. Top left, I'm not sure if you can read that, but this is the Center for Humane Technology. Their strapline is, as long as social media companies profit from addiction, depression, and division, our society will continue to be at risk. And this is something that's becoming very attractive increasingly to coders, people working in the tech space, who are aware of some of the dopamine-driven addictive logics of the largest tech companies and are working directly to shed a light on this. Bottom left, we've got Mozilla Labs that we mentioned briefly before, and bottom right as well, Tech Human, that we'll come to in a second. We wanted to add to that as well, the fact of learning from others and learning from other authors. So here's just a small array of a few people that we've benefited reading and learning from. The first is Sherry Turkle, Professor Sherry Turkle in MIT. She talks about habits and the habit of conversation. Conversation allows us to restore empathy, to restore the capacity for empathy between embodied persons, and to recover really what's essential to being human. She's got some brilliant books that we would highly commend. Secondly, on simplicity, the Professor Cal Newport talks of digital minimalism, and he writes about what does it mean to rediscover an analog life with digital minimalism, where we recognize there's many parts of our lives where we're entwined, enmeshed in digital logics. We'll never get out of them. But how can we celebrate other aspects of our life in an analog sense? And then bottom left, the importance of rooted local living, of locality, from Susan Pinker, also writing in the States. She talks about deep local community acting as an antidote to loneliness and addiction in the digital space. And then finally, this term behavioral architecture that I really like, talking about boundaries. And this is from Adam Alter in New York. He says, we can all become addicted under the right conditions. And we're particularly vulnerable to technology because of its irresistibility, its addiction, or what some call the patina of glamour. The shiny newness of it means we all are left open to this kind of addictive design, addictive logic. And I just wanted to end on that point with this wonderful quote from the philosopher James Hunter Davidson. He says, culture is most powerful when it's perceived as self-evident. Culture is most powerful when it's perceived as self-evident. And in a way, this is why we're so excited to have had a chance to write this paper and also to present some of it today with you all, to open up a conversation and recognize that many of these logics are not self-evident. They've been very carefully crafted. They've been very carefully thought through. And we want to kind of shed light on these logics. So this paper is very much a trigger. It's very much a springboard. It's not a destination. We want to open up to the questions. We encourage you as well to join the conversation on techhuman.org that Jonathan set up. And I'll hand back now to Jonathan Tame to lead us in the Q&A. Thank you very much.